Let's bring in Jeff McCausland from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's a CBS News Radio national security consultant. Jeff, let's begin with this. Last year, the U.S. acted alone. This time, you've got the UK and France by its side. What do you see as the significance of this year's joint response?
Well, this is very significant. Not only does it expand the amount of military capabilities, though quite candidly, the United States had sufficient capabilities, we could have conducted the operations alone. But the significance then is much more political. It shows the solidarity of the United States with our two principal allies, the British and the French, both of which are permanent members of the UN Security Council, which will be important as the UN Security Council is going to meet later today. And I'm sure the Russians will complain and criticize this operation quite loudly. But it shows that the international community is not going to stand idly by and watch this particular very important international legal norm about prohibition of the use of chemical weapons to go without a response. But, I think even more importantly, Errol, it also sends a very clear message to Moscow that the United States and its principal NATO allies are united in opposition to things that Russia is doing around the world. We've seen this attack clearly by the Russians against a former Russian spy living in Great Britain using nerve gas, obviously interference in our elections, and continued Russian military operations in eastern Ukraine, in addition to supporting this client state, Syria, in its use of chemical weapons against its population.
Now, Jeff, twice as much firepower was used this time around when compared to last year, but even last year's effort still resulted in yet more chemical weapons attacks by Syria against its own people. Was the U.S. calculation that it had to be an increase from what happened last year, but not too much to trigger direct conflict between the U.S., Russia, and Syria?
Well, I think you're exactly right. You could call this the Goldilocks strategy. In other words, not too hot that ended up in a major confrontation with the Russians, not too cold that not doing anything and allowing this to continue, and so trying to hit that just right sweet spot. And that's clearly what they have attempted to do here, now going not only at the launch platforms for chemical weapons like we did last year, the air base, but as you see, going after the research and development community, as well as storage sites and command and control sites up there in homes, because the objective was twofold. One was to degrade the Syrian chemical weapons capability, and it seems very, very likely that we have done that, though they had a few days with advanced warning of this impending attack where they may have been able to move some things around. But the more important thing, having a larger international response, because the real mission here is to deter the future use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, sending him a very clear message that this type of action will not be tolerated.
So chemical weapons storage facilities were hit, but the Syrian military itself is still relatively intact. So overall, how damaging really was this to the Assad regime?
Well, I think in many ways not very damaging at all. In part, I think it's possible that this Russian almost no response in the light of this particular attack, in military terms at least, they may have been surprised by the Syrians' use of chemical weapons in Douma to begin with. The Assad government has been clearly winning this particular war. And so therefore, from a military standpoint, it seems unclear to me why they felt a need to use chemical weapons in that particular operation. And so as a consequence as well, then, the degrading to their overall military capability may be somewhat limited, because as the Pentagon has said, our focal point was to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons, but really not to get involved in this civil war. So at the end of the day, the message is, Mr. Assad, do not use chemical weapons against your populations. But unfortunately, we seem willing to accept the fact that he may continue to use conventional weapons, barrel bombs, aircraft, artillery against his population. And over time, of course, that's resulted in half of the population of this country now being refugees and 500,000 dead.
Yeah, and I did notice the Pentagon acknowledging that very point when pressed by reporters at today's briefing. Jeff McCausland, thank you very much for your time.